Matriz, alternative virtual reality.
All right. So we're back in this nice library, and today I'm sitting here with Aaron Ralby. And Aaron, you are the founder of Linguisticator, which I think is a super interesting company because you're dealing with, and you'll explain it better yourself, but something close to like memory palaces or different mnemonic tricks using virtual reality for memorization, which we think is super interesting, and we've discussed it on this podcast and on the YouTube channel AltVR, which this is hosted on before. So it will be really interesting to talk to you about these things. So can you just give a brief introduction to yourself and Linguisticator?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Linguisticator is a company that develops language and memory training programs. So it was originally focused primarily on language learning. And my background is actually in medieval studies. I did my PhD in medieval studies at Cornell. And it was during my PhD that I really became interested in memory techniques as they were used in the Middle Ages for learning really large and complex subjects. And so Linguisticator was designed as a way of applying these medieval memory techniques to modern subjects and specifically languages. So we have a number of online courses that teach different languages, and we take a very systematic approach to understanding how the languages work and what all the different parts and pieces are. And then how you can, once you understand the content that you're learning, how you can store that in your memory using spatial memory systems or memory palaces. And over time, as the company has developed, we found that just using the imagination wasn't really sufficient for explaining how to apply these really old techniques to very large and complex subjects. Because while you can, sort of demonstrate the concept of a memory palace quite simply, applying those basic principles to something really, really big and complex like the entire grammar of a language, it's a big sort of mental burden, and it's very hard to transfer the image of a memory palace from one person's imagination to another's. And so several years ago, we started the development of Monks VR, which is a software specifically built for creating and sharing memory palaces in virtual reality.
That's so cool. Yeah, the first time I heard of, Linguisticator and what was then called Makungs VR and now Monks VR was when I did my master's, which is maybe 4 years ago. And already then you had developed this, and did it start off as a Kickstarter? Is that correct?
Yeah, so prior to the Kickstarter, we were I was using architectural software to kind of build out demo memory palaces for different parts of different languages, and then we ran a Kickstarter to kind of see if there would be interest in this, and then that was quite successful, and we raised a lot more than we had sort of set out to raise, and we in addition to the sort of monetary benefit of that, we got a bunch of interest and press and made a bunch of connections and relationships that helped us then actually develop the software.
That's really cool. Yeah, and I think you're a perfect person to ask this since you had studied medieval studies. But to those of you who are listening, we could briefly explain the memory palace. And of course, this is visuospatial organizations of associations to things that you have learned or know. But it, of course, has a much broader history. I mean, we may remember this from like Sherlock series or Hannibal in the literature, but this is a really old technique that has been used heavily within the oral tradition. And yeah, could you briefly explain some of its history?
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's actually quite a lot written in ancient sources about its sort of origins as a predefined technique in ancient Greece. The sort of legendary founder is Simonides of Chaos, who could recall who was, the story is he's called out from a dinner party, and there's an earthquake and the building collapses, and he's able to identify all of the bodies by where people were sitting, so he could remember the positions and of people at this dinner. And so there's this sort of principle of location-based memory, and that we're very good at remembering where things are and have very good spatial navigation. And so we can apply this kind of spatial memory to learning symbolic information, textual or numerical information. And throughout ancient Rome, there's quite a lot written about what's called artificial memory, and that is this process of creating associations between something that is symbolic or difficult to remember, and associating that with something physical, tangible, and wacky and easy to remember, and then placing that mnemonic image into a space so that we have a location for that association. And then this technique was then developed further in the Middle Ages and used to do some really, really extraordinary feats of memory that most of us would consider impossible today. So, monks and scholars would learn the entire Bible by heart and be able to not just memorize the entire text, but be able to access any passage within it by chapter number and verse number. And one thing that's really important that I just want to throw out there, because a lot of people think of memory today as a rote exercise, and memory in the Middle Ages was considered a creative tool. And so the process of remembering was creative because you had to create associations between something you didn't know and that you were trying to remember, and things that you already did know. But it was also used as a tool for composition. And so the way I actually became interested in memory was because I was looking at a Middle High German text, Parzify, by Wolfgang von Eschenbach, and the composition of it is immensely complex, and it would have been composed orally, perhaps with the aid of a wax tablet, but there wasn't scratch paper or anything like this, so it would have been composed in the mind of Eschenbach, and so how did he do this? And I asked, and it incorporates like all kinds of ecclesiastical calendars and timelines in a way that even today with sort of project management software would be really, really difficult to replicate in terms of composition. And I asked my supervisor for Middle High German, how could he do this? And so he said, well, you got to go read the Book of Memory by Mary Carruthers. And so that's all about the sort of scholarly tradition of memory as a trained and learned skill in the Middle Ages, and its sort of heritage from, it's sort of coming, its origins in the ancient world, and how it then developed further throughout the medieval period. So memory is a very, what we're talking about here in terms of memory palaces and spatial memory is really a creative process.
Yes, that's really interesting. And what I'm also thinking is that, today we have so many things that are helping us to remember. We take notes on our smartphones, and we always have this information available. So the sort of critical question that I'm often, maybe mostly asking myself, but sometimes being asked by others when I'm interested in memory palaces, that is, when are we needing this? Of course, it says linguisticator right over your name here. So
Right.
Languages is of course one of these answers, but where do you think it really becomes useful for memorizing?
Well, I'll touch on languages first, because people sometimes they'll say I'll show how you can learn the complexities of a grammar really quickly, or you look at some of the spaces for a really large part of the grammar of a language, and the space looks really kind of manageable and simple, and you can learn your way around relatively quickly. And people then go, okay, but how do I use that? I have it all memorized. How do I actually use it? And one thing that's really, really important to understand when you're talking about language is you cannot say anything you don't know. If you are learning another language and you need a word for something, if it is not in your memory, you cannot retrieve it. So a memory palace is not just about storage, but also about recall. And that's one of the things that I find most useful about Memory Palace is that it essentially creates a recall mechanism. Often when we're learning something, if you take language again as an example. So what often happens is people start with great enthusiasm. They spend a few weeks studying a language. They're excited. They're, can say hello and introduce themselves. And then after 3 weeks, the sort of quantity and the complexity of the material starts to get a little bit overwhelming. And people start to forget what they did in week 1. And then by week 4, they're having to spend all their time going back and reviewing what they did in week 1. And then it becomes less fun because your progress slows down and you find yourself just sort of, bogged down. And a memory palace allows not only for the storage, but for the recall. And that's one of the things that's most exciting is that you can remember places that you visited 20 years ago and haven't visited since. But you can't remember, the text of the paragraph that you read 2 weeks ago exactly. And then when you look at it again, if you look at it and you say, oh, that's right, and you remember having studied it. We all have had that experience where you can't recall something, you look it up and you go, that's right, that's what it was. With a memory palace, it creates that kind of stepping stone that allows you to actually get back to the information you've learned. So it gives you that ability to recall what you've done. And this creates all kinds of exciting opportunities. And it's really hard to explain this unless you've had the experience of using memory palaces, because what it does is it allows you to, it does several things. One, it transforms your sort of perception of volume of information. So what looks like a huge amount of information to learn suddenly becomes very sort of small and manageable. A list of verbal endings in a language can look absolutely daunting. But when you understand how to put that into space and use space to organize those endings and represent the structure of the verbal system, it's really not that bad. And you're like, oh, okay. And so your perception of quantity changes and your perception of complexity also changes. And then the next thing that does is it allows you to draw connections between things. When you have information not only stored but readily accessible in your mind, you can instantly create comparisons between them and mull them over. And this is what in the Middle Ages, if you're learning scripture, you would the concept of rumination. It's chewing on the information. So it was a memory as a kind of meditative practice. You would store this information in your memory and then sit with it and chew on it. And you would draw comparisons between one passage and another within the Bible. And you could do that because it was all there and all accessible. And so there's all kinds of opportunities in many disciplines where connections are really what we need to be making. Mm-hmm. And so, beyond language, where of course you actually have to have readily accessible in your memory the entire grammar and a vocabulary of several thousand words in order to be able to speak that language fluently. In other disciplines, let's say in medicine, for example, you need to have a knowledge of the drugs and pharmacology and be able to understand the interactions between different drugs. You need to have a really profound understanding of anatomy and the connections between different systems within the body. There's all kinds of disciplines which require a large and complex knowledge requirement.
Yeah, for sure. I have a friend who was a memory champion. I can't remember what his precise record were, but it was something with chord memorization. And he actually wrote a book for medical students on how to use the method of loci to memorize anatomy. I really agree with what you're saying, especially that, if you can't remember what you've learned, then it's really of no value if you're not able to retrieve it. And I also recall a study of, I can only remember the last name of one of the authors, but Putnam, who was looking into what sort of role mnemonics should have in school, because today it's not really systematically incorporated in any school system, not much at any rate. And in this study where they had done this, they found that, I mean, although it doesn't necessarily have to change the total way of the way students are learning, what it did help was for the students to feel empowered, because they had this as a tool to actually use when they felt fault for it. So you may feel that you can approach learning in a way where you have control over what you learn and how you learn and how you can systematize that knowledge. And I think that can be very powerful.
Absolutely.
You don't have to learn something, read something, and it's by chance whether you can recall it or not. No, you can approach this in a more systematic manner. These are the things I'm going to learn, and approach it like that.
Absolutely. A few years ago, I did a sort of informal study with children in the Cambridge area in England who had dyslexia and different learning disabilities, to see how spatial memory techniques and memory palaces could be would benefit, because it was one of the most common questions that we were getting. Because one of the things that's amazing about a memory palace is it's a way of learning textual and numerical information, but there is no text or number in the memory palace itself. And so it sort of lends itself to those with dyslexia who may be incredibly intelligent and bright, but struggle with the medium of text. And you're absolutely right. A lot of these kids who couldn't remember their own phone numbers or sort of essential information about their own lives, you could see how meaningful it was to them to be empowered. I'll just say it was very, very successful, and these kids would learn something like numbers was a great place to start with them, and they would remember their phone number 2-3 weeks later without any revision in between, and that was for them incredibly empowering. One challenge though, and this sort of brings up another topic that I think is quite important, is that there's actually understanding the how to apply memory techniques to different subjects does require a significant amount of practice and training. And there's a difference between mnemonics and memory palaces, and I make a difference. I feel like we need a wider nomenclature for this subject, because to me, a memory journey is different from a memory palace. And just organizing things spatially doesn't necessarily make it a memory palace. And sometimes I see people who'll say, look, I made a virtual memory palace, and what they've done is they've just taken snippets of text and put it into space. And to me, that's spatial organization. It's cool and it has utility, but it's not a memory palace because you don't have that association.
Yes.
And so, when we're looking at using these techniques widely, we need to understand the nuances of this, because when I was a kid, I studied Japanese in school, and we were given mnemonics without any kind of spatial framework. But we were given someone else's mnemonics, and it never worked for me. I hated it because I didn't make those associations. And so I only remember, 3 or 4 of them because they were the only ones that made sense to me. If I had been taught to create my own association, or if I had been given a spatial system to organize those associations, it would have been completely different. So the sort of line of failure for these techniques can be quite fine. And it's really important to understand what has to be done by an individual user and what can be passed on and transferred from one person to another.
Yes.
I think that those are sort of like really, really important topics.
Yeah, we had we met before in Mozilla Hubs with Fabian and Kent, and we discussed some of these issues, because when you're developing software for this, as you are doing and as I've been doing somewhat through my research, and as Fabian kind of is doing with his wiki, then the question is, if we're going to take this to a broader public, to which degree can you create other people's associations? And their memory palaces, because there are some trade-offs there. I mean, we even talked about procedural generation of memory palaces just to make this.
Right.
In your experience, what is the sort of sweet spot between guiding and helping and allowing for free association? Do you have some reflections on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something that I've thought a lot about over the last several years as we've developed our software. And what I found is that if we look broadly at memory palaces as they're used today, a lot of focus is placed on mnemonics. And you see people create mnemonic systems, and they say, to learn this word or this character in Chinese or Japanese, think of this, right? And they've created an association. Depending on who you are, that will either work or it won't. And very rarely will an entire mnemonic system work for you. It's useful to have suggestions, especially when people are just getting started. It's useful to see what kinds of things you could create as associations. And there is a skill to this as well. Some people their association will be based on sound, and they'll come up with an adjective. But an adjective isn't visual, so it's harder for them to remember. And so at this point, when I watch people create mnemonics for things, I can usually tell right away whether they're going to remember it or not. That itself is a skill. But mnemonics themselves are very rarely transferable easily. It's good to give suggestions, but on that side of things, I really think that the user should have some degree of control. Spatial frameworks, however, are transferable. So when I've never been in this space before, and you said, let's come in here and let's sit here. My reaction is, okay, I don't have a sort of strong reaction against it. I don't want to say let's sit at that table over there instead of this table. It's totally fine. We're in a space. It's cool. We can look around. Great. And the point is to use the space for a conversation. And that's often what happens with transferring spaces between people. If I say use this association and you say, well, I don't like that thing, and that doesn't make sense to me. People often react very strongly against given mnemonics, but very rarely react against a given space. So what we found is that particularly for complex subjects, the space can be fully transferable. And then you want to provide a way to maybe suggest mnemonics or provide options for mnemonics in case somebody is really kind of struggling on the mnemonic creation front, because some people do have a lot of trouble creating mnemonics, but you want to give some degree of control. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that the mnemonic for something is an alligator. Okay. Well, if I just tell you it's an alligator, your image of an alligator might be different from my image of an alligator. So even if we use the same concept of a mnemonic, we may actually choose a different image. Maybe you choose a 2D photograph of an alligator. Maybe you choose a baby alligator. Maybe you choose a large alligator. Maybe you choose a cartoon alligator. But it's all kind of the same concept. So even if we're using the same quote unquote association, we may use a different image. And having that degree of choice where you're actually getting to decide what you want is part of the memory process. And so that's why I feel like it's really important that people choose their own mnemonic to a certain degree and place it within the space. But from my experience in building memory palaces for complex subjects, it's really, really challenging to set up a memory palace for something like the grammar of a language. It takes a lot of training, because we're not just talking about having a mnemonic for an ending and putting it in the space. You want that recall mechanism. So you want to be able to, in real time, find exactly what you're looking for. So if I need the past tense and I need third person, I know exactly where it is. I don't need to go through a long journey of other sort of unrelated endings to get to what I want. So being able to set up that kind of system, for a language, it requires you to really understand the structure of the language so that that structure can be mimicked in the space. Now, the cool thing about that is that, as I said before, a lot of focus these days is on mnemonics. And if you look at people who do numbers, they'll sometimes pack, 4 or more numbers into a single image. Well, on the language side of things, we can pack information into the space. So we can pack, 5 or 10 pieces of information into a particular location. So maybe I need to remember a specific ending. Maybe an A ending is an alligator and the alligator is over here. Maybe this location, though, is specific to a particular type of verb, a particular mood. Maybe it's indicative, maybe it's present tense, maybe it's, third person singular. And so I know from the location what I'm, what kind of information I'm getting. And then the actual image just holds the specific sort of piece of information that I'm looking for. So we can encode, and this is what's really, really exciting about using virtual spaces, we can encode the complexity of a really, really large subject into the space. And then you look at the space and, you can learn the verbal system of language in a matter of hours by understanding the structure of the space. But actually building that in the first place takes a lot of work. So spaces, I feel, and structures are easily transferable, but mnemonic creation has to be kind of supported, but there needs to be some kind of user input and active engagement, at the very least, for that to stick in the memory.
Yeah, I get that. And it's also nice that there is possibility of some sort of transfer value, in doing these systems, and that there is some sort of efficiency in structure, like architecturally, that can be transferred between cases. Another issue which I found myself in developing apps for this has been, when you have the sort of competing method when doing this in VR is the free imagination of ourselves. If I'm going to visualize something like an alligator, I can also make that alligator have a hat and a wand, so follow the suggestions of those early philosophers and orators who said that you should make something a bit bizarre or rememberable and so on. And this is harder. Of course, we are still on the internet, so the internet, of course, almost has all of these things, but we don't have giant 3D libraries yet, although it's getting better. So in my case, the solution to this was to give in text keywords, so it would retrieve a random image, or not random, but an image specific to that keyword from Google Images, but then it's not 3D in the same way, it loses the aesthetic. So what is the sweet spot between, how many, what are the users able to choose and so on? Is it like a list of 10 things, or?
No, so in our software, there's it's currently set up so that it's integrated with Google Poly for 3D models. So there's quite a large number of 3D models there. So you could actually have an alligator with a hat and a wand. That's not a problem. And you could choose the alligator and choose the hat and choose the wand. I actually know, I can see in my mind's eye several images for hats, wands, and alligators. But we also have it integrated with Pixabay. So you can add in 2D images. And then there's also the option to create or save images and photos and add those as 2D images. So you can add your own 2D images. So if you happen to see an alligator with a hat and a wand and took a picture of it, you could put that into the software. So there's quite a degree of flexibility, and that will improve over time as we are able to as more libraries become available and as we integrate with more libraries. But one thing that I think is really important is to not lose sight of the fact that the value of, I like to say that the real value of our software is when you take the headset off and you remember the space. So I think of a memory palace as having 3 different things to make it a memory palace. The first is the space, and that's the sort of container for organizing. The second is the mnemonic and associations between what you're trying to learn and what you know already. And those are then placed into the space. And the third component is some kind of narrative component or story to tie things together. Now, depending on what you're learning, this will take a different form. So if you look at sort of ancient medieval examples, if you're learning an actual story, well, the story's already there, right? So if you're learning a text, even if you're learning the Bible, there is a narrative thread there. So you don't need to add an extra component of story to it. But sometimes if you're learning something really abstract, then you need to create some kind of story to tie those pieces together. And one of the things that you can do is still use your imagination. And so this is a kind of crutch or hook. So if you have a model of an alligator, you can then create some kind of story about this being this magical, this magician alligator who turns, fish into giant fish so he can eat them and get bigger or something like that. And, whatever, you can create your own story. And so you see the alligator, and that triggers then the rest of this story. You don't necessarily need to have a realistic depiction of everything, of the exact association. So you need a hook. And the thing for me that's really exciting is that you could do this all in your imagination, but it's a huge mental burden for something, that's a really, really large subject. And so by kind of outloading that onto a software, particularly a virtual reality software that you can physically explore and remember spatially, it sort of augments our ability and possibility.
Yes.
So I often have a virtual space, but kind of have imagined elements even on top of that, to sort of tie things together and make it more lively and memorable.
Yes, because that was supposed to be I was thinking about this as an interesting question for you too. Traditional memory techniques, they are very hard to beat. I mean, like you say, people can remember the whole Bible word for word, which is insane, but they really can. And the world records in the memory competitions worldwide, it's just insane to see what they're able to do. But most
Absolutely.
people are not using those techniques. They are not actually incorporating them. So VR can, of course, be used for those who, like me. I mean, I remember my wife, she used to do this when she was studying for psychology, but I thought it sounded so boring to actually sit down and think of all these associations. But making it into a software, sort of, okay, now we're talking, this is more interesting. And at least virtual reality, when it can be experiential. And yeah, it's interesting to think of the fact that that you can actually experience it, and it's also interesting to see how effective it is to organize things visual spatially when it's just in your mind. I mean, even that works. How much better wouldn't our actual experience of the visual and actual experience of three-dimensional stereoscopic environments be? But yeah, I really enjoy that what you're saying about. It doesn't mean that you have to do everything virtually. Of course, you can still make a story of the objects you're seeing, and you can even, if there is just the normal alligator, you can still imagine him as the wizard alligator that has all these things.
Absolutely.
So why not just combine both of them?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where as well with mnemonics, if you're giving someone who's just starting out, you're giving pre-chosen mnemonics, let's say, because they're just learning the technique, you can still have them create the narrative component on top of that. And that can be a very powerful tool for a beginner. So there are a few things that then become really exciting. So as you said, like just seeing the space, you're looking at the same data as you would on a page, but you understand it completely differently, and you start to see patterns in ways that you wouldn't. So in a few days, I'll be releasing a memory palace for the regular and auxiliary verbal system of French, and it's a surprisingly minimalist space. I have actually sat down and taken a couple of students through this to test it out in 5 hours. The entire thing. I had pre-chosen mnemonics and pre-chosen stories, and they were able to learn every ending in the regular and auxiliary verbal system in 5 hours. And a week later, they had probably about 80 to 90% retention of that. And the reason that this was possible was because when I first built this space, it was much, much larger because I was building out for every ending of every conjugation that was necessary for this part of the verbal system. But as I did that, I then was able to see kind of a sort of structure underneath the underneath, and was able to then pull this out and kind of reduce the footprint significantly. So basically I was able to create a kind of artificial conjugation that represented the majority of the verbal system. And then for each conjugation that you had to learn, whether it was an irregular or one of the main conjugations, you could only actually needed to learn where that conjugation was different from what I call the key. And in most cases, this is only a handful of items. So instead of having 75 endings or something like that to learn for each conjugation, 70 or so, you really only have one room with the full conjugation and sort of 5 to 10 for everything else. And so this makes it actually, and that's something that without actually seeing it in space, I wouldn't have thought to sort of condense the data in this way. And so there's all kinds of exciting things that you can do from just actually visualizing information and getting to see the patterns spatially like that. And then also in terms of sharing, a lot of people, as you said, they look at this as being a kind of labor-intensive task. And when you look at what takes time to do, one is setting up the space and organizing the space. And if you have a house or an apartment or flat or whatever, and you use that for one subject, you don't really want to reuse the same space for every subject. So you're kind of freed from that constraint in virtual reality because you can create an unlimited number of virtual spaces. But then also there's the burden of review in the imagination. If you forget something, there's a kind of mental pain associated with that because you have to go back and figure out what was your association or recreate it and then put it back in. It's quite frustrating. So with virtual tools, we can transfer spaces, so they're pre-built. So that can remove all of that time and effort. We can provide suggestions for mnemonic, and there is you have to do something. You have to choose which ones you want. But then in terms of review, you can explore the space, and everything is then saved in that space. And so for people who are skeptical of the technique or think that it's boring, you can, using the imagination, you can very quickly see the value by doing something small in virtual reality, or even just in a virtual space on a 2D screen, and a lot of the sort of burden, the work, can be taken away. So that's something that I find really exciting. And the other thing and this is the thing that I think is most exciting, is that most of the examples of memory techniques are for things that are, they might be very large in volume. So, thousands of numbers, or, even something structurally like the entire Bible. It's basically a list. To do it by chapter and number is a little bit more complicated. But, that sort of gap between understanding how you take an association and put it in space, and then how do you apply that to learning something that isn't a list at all, where you really need to understand the connections between different parts of a complex system. That's what's really exciting about using virtual spaces, is that someone who understands that system and understands the technique can build the space and then transfer it. And that is what I feel like really opens things up to people using this technique.
Yes. Yeah, that's really great. And what you're saying about that you first made this very detailed structure and sort of later could see the pattern that emerged, it's like a super sampling of information. And it's interesting to see how spatial structures can emerge out of this. I was thinking about something regarding this memory palace, because when I'm thinking about this subject, I find that what I'm mostly interested in really is like this romantic ideation of having a place where you can go that is sort of stable, that you can maybe build over time. And I'm imagining this sort of like in, I mean, I mentioned Hannibal earlier, but in the books, it is written that it's not just a place for memories for him, but more like a mind palace, sort of a place where he can dwell or simultaneously be like having various rooms for various moods, and maybe thought processes, meditation, and so on. Of course, it's a bit off topic on the whole being practical, actually learning, actually having a utility in the most direct sense. But have you had any thoughts about this? How this could be extended? I mean, not just learning something concrete, but just having it as an approach to life, like a notebook, or in a wider sense.
Absolutely. I mean, and this is where I feel like we need actually different names for things, because it gets confusing calling everything a memory palace, or people say the method of Loki, but that's just concretely just locations, or so we need different names for this, and that's something that I feel like we should collectively work to do, is to distinguish spatial organization from a memory journey, from a memory palace, from a sort of mental space for rumination, or what is there a difference between a memory palace and a mind palace, as you're sort of saying. I think it would really help to distinguish these in name, because there are different uses and there are different applications for having these kind of mental spaces. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, there's this whole tradition of rumination, and for me, even with practical subjects where I'm trying to remember something concrete for the purpose of learning that subject, there is an aspect of rumination later, and it's quite exciting when you see something related to that subject, and something gets triggered in your memory palace, and you go, that's over here, or that's over there, I have memory palaces for different texts, and was I have one for the art of war. I have actually been building one for the Bible, because it's something that a lot of people are interested in, and so it is quite fun sometimes when I'm going for a walk or something like that. I'll just think to, okay, what just start going through the sort of aphorisms of the art of war, and so even with something that is sort of concrete and practical, there is this aspect of rumination. And there are other things that I do I've experimented with using imaginative techniques for, let's say you're out doing something. I mean, maybe not during the pandemic, but you're somewhere where you can't write something down, and can you create a kind of, imagine that you kind of reach down and you pull out a piece of paper, and you kind of imagine mnemonics on top of that, and so you create this kind of spatial list of to-do list, or and then you can then fold it away, and you can put it here, or you can put it on your head, or you can pull it out of your ear, or whatever it is. There's all kinds of different ways of applying these kind of spatial and associative techniques, and I think it's really cool and exciting, and I think we should sort of explore and sort of set out what are the different possibilities for this, and really get clear on what they are, and what their uses are, and what their values are, and how to do each of them separately.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of potential as well. And what you're saying, that, being reminded of something, that you're immediately going to this place in your mind that you have in your mind palace. I mean, I think if people are trying to notice how often their memories are tied to specific locations, you'll be really surprised. Yeah. I mean, if you're listening to a podcast another time, or another song, it's like, oh, that was exactly the spot I were the last time. And what comes with that is not just an image, it's a feeling of this spaciousness that you're around, and various ways that this can be tied up to things, I think, can be enormously potential.
Absolutely, and so one of the things that people often say is like that it's visual, right? And it's just visual. And I said, well, no, it's really experiential, because even if you're in a VR memory palace and you see a virtual apple, right? You have associated with that the smell and taste of an apple. And so you can recall in your mind, whether you're aware of it or not, it usually recalls that the texture, the taste, the sound of crunching into it, maybe an apple pie. There's all kinds of associations that we have that engage all of the senses. So the visual is sort of the key, because that's what we, create in VR. But it is really experiential. And when we're creating associations, we're using all of the senses to create those. And you're absolutely right. When we often can recall, oh yeah, I was exactly in this spot when I heard this song, or when I learned this word, or when this happened. But it also happens subconsciously, where things are firing in our mind, where we're making these associations without even really being aware of it, between when and where we were. And we might be walking and smell the scent of a particular flower, and it brings back a memory from childhood. There's all kinds of associations tied with these experiences, and being able to kind of harness that and become conscious of that as a process, and then use that for different applications is really exciting.
Yeah, man, I really agree. So it was great to have this conversation, but I think we should mention that Monks VR is available at Steam, right?
Yes, that's right. So there's a free version available on Steam, and there's also a premium version, and we have a lot of pre-built memory palaces, several of which are free, that you can download and try out and explore either on desktop. It works with both Mac and PC on a desktop, or in virtual reality.
Well, that's great. Then people can check it out, and I think we're going to check it out and do a video on it at YouTube as well, because we're trying to cover this from many angles. We've shown a video where people can do it through Mozilla Hubs, which I'll link in the video description, and also just a video from some of my personal memory palaces, just to try to show the concept and how people can do this. But Linguisticator is a free demo at Steam, so we'll link that to you in the description. And thanks a lot, Aaron. It was a pleasure talking.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. There's also just quickly, we have a bunch of demos as well on YouTube. So different memory palaces for different subjects.
Awesome. I'll link that as well.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks for having me.